1 yard of dry volcanic ash on Iwo Jima stopped more shrapnel than 2 yards of Norman sandbag did on Omaha. That is a sentence the official Marine Corps history will not quite put down on the page. But it sits, in different words, in the after-action report of the 5th Marine Division Pioneer Battalion, written up in pencil 2 months after the island was declared secure. I have a photostat of the relevant page on my desk while I write this. The corner is dog-eared. There is a coffee ring on the lower margin that I did not put there. The man who first laid the ash that way was a staff sergeant named Hubert Calloway. The peer NCO who tore his pencil sketch out of his hand on D+1 in front of half the section called him the engineer who was afraid of his own perimeter. The nickname stuck for 9 days. 22 Marines walked out of his pillbox on the morning of the 10th. The same peer NCO who tore the sketch went up the slope that morning with a folding rule and a notebook and measured the angle of the ash cap 1 quiet hour after sunrise. I have seen the notebook. The drawing is dated. This is the story of those 9 days. It opens, like a lot of these stories open, with a sentence the schoolbook leaves out. Sergeants did not sketch under fire on Iwo Jima. There was no time. There was no dry surface. There was, on D+1, no part of the southern beachhead that was not under direct or plunging fire from the slopes of Suribachi. The schoolbook picture is a sergeant urging his squad forward with his sidearm in the air. The schoolbook picture is correct in its way for most sergeants who landed there. It was not correct for Calloway. Calloway sat with his back against the rusted starboard track of a wrecked LVT, took a stub of pencil out of his utility jacket pocket, and began drawing on the back of a Hershey-Wrapper. The first thing he drew was a cross-section of a hole in the ground. The second thing he drew was the angle of the cap above the hole. That angle is the reason 22 Marines walked out of the lower southwest slope of Mount Suribachi on the morning of the 1st of March, 1945, and that one of those Marines was named Hugh McLaren, and that McLaren is the man who tore the wrapper out of Calloway's hand 36 hours earlier. I will not pretend that I know exactly what McLaren said when he later picked up his folding rule. The 5th Marine Division Pioneer Battalion, AAR, does not record speeches. It records measurements. The measurement McLaren wrote down on day 10 matched the angle Calloway drew on the Hershey-Wrapper. There is no other contemporaneous comment in the file. Whether McLaren said anything aloud to Calloway in the interval, the unit war diary does not say. The result was the same. I have changed Calloway's name. The unit is real. The angle is real. The men inside the pillbox are real. 2 of the survivor names in this script are composites built out of 3 rosters. The corpsman's first name is altered. The engineering solution is in the after-action report, in pencil, on page 7, second paragraph, just under a line that reads, in the original hand, ash compacted dry, 3 lifts, sandbag course at upper face, 12 degrees from horizontal. The names beneath that paragraph are not the names I will give you. The angle is. Now we begin. Red Beach 1, Iwo Jima. The morning of February 20th, 1945. D+1. The wind off the volcano carried sulfur and burnt cordite in roughly equal parts. The sand was not sand. It was loose black volcanic ash, dry and clinging and bottomless. And it swallowed a Marine to the calf at every step. An LVT could not climb it. A bulldozer dug itself into a pit trying. The seawall above the high water mark was 8 feet of compacted ash and dune grass. And the engineers had been told, in the planning briefings aboard the LST that took them in, that the seawall was the first obstacle, and that breaching it was the day one priority of the Marine pioneers. The planners had not seen Iwo Jima. Calloway came in on the second wave of the second LVT serial, on a Tuesday morning that was already gray and smelled like a closed garage. The LVT in front of his took a direct hit from a 70mm howitzer, fired off the lower slopes of Suribachi, and stopped in 12 feet of water with the ramp still down. The men inside went over the side. Calloway saw 3 of them go down before they reached the surf. He did not see any of them come up. His own LVT veered hard right, climbed a hump of sand that should not have been there, and ditched its tracks in the soft ash 20 yards short of the seawall. The driver shouted something Calloway did not catch. The ramp went down, the men came off. Calloway went off third, with his entrenching tool in his left hand and his M1 carbine in his right, and he walked into a wall of noise. The noise had layers. The lowest layer was the Type 92 heavy machine gun on the upper slope, hammering at the seawall in 3-second bursts. The middle layer was the small arms fire from spider holes that nobody had yet located. The top layer was the mortar walk, a methodical pattern of Japanese 81mm rounds traversing the beach left to right and then right to left on a metronome no one had managed to break. He made it to the seawall. He pressed his back against it. 2 Marines from his section piled in beside him in the next 30 seconds and did not say anything. A corpsman whose name Calloway did not yet know was already at the far end of the seawall on his knees, with his elbows in the ash, working on a Marine whose left leg was open to the bone above the knee. Calloway watched the corpsman for a half-minute. Then he turned his head left and saw what the rest of his section had landed into. There were maybe 40 Marines pinned along a 60-yard stretch of seawall. Casualties were already accumulating against the inside face of the wall, propped sitting against it, some moving, some not. The original order, the order Calloway had been given on the LST the night before, was clear lanes through the seawall, push inland, build cover north of the wall for the casualty collection point that was already being set up in the lee of a wrecked LVT. The order had been written by a man who had not seen the ash. Calloway sat down in the ash with his back against the seawall and took the pencil stub out of his utility jacket pocket and the folded brown Hershey-Wrapper out of the other pocket, and he started drawing. He drew the cross-section of a hole in the ground. He drew the cap above it. He drew the angle of the cap and wrote the number 12 next to it. He drew an offset to the entry, set 90 degrees to the line of fire from the upper slope. He wrote a small note in the margin, in a hand that was almost legible. Ash, 3 lifts, dry sandbag, course 1, upper face mound 12. He had been sketching for perhaps 90 seconds when Sergeant Hugh McLaren walked along the inside face of the seawall and saw him. McLaren was a pioneer NCO from C Company, 5th Pioneer Battalion. He had landed in the first wave on Red Beach 1 40 minutes earlier. He had a fresh shrapnel cut across the outside of his left wrist that he had not yet had bandaged. He had been told by Major Dyer, who was on the beach somewhere up to the right, that the casualty collection point needed cover, and he had been moving down the seawall, trying to find his own squad, when he saw Calloway sitting in the ash with a pencil. McLaren stopped. He looked down at Calloway. He looked at the Hershey-Wrapper. He looked at the angle drawn on it. He said, in the kind of voice a senior NCO uses when he wants the men nearby to hear him say it, "Calloway, what in the name of God are you drawing?" Calloway did not look up. He said, "A cover, a cover, a cover." McLaren stood there for a moment in his torn utility jacket, with the shrapnel cut bleeding down the back of his left hand, and the noise of the Type 92 hammering at the seawall 10 feet over his head, and he laughed. It was not a long laugh. It was the laugh of a man who has just heard something stupid at the worst possible time. Then he reached down, took the Hershey-Wrapper out of Calloway's hand, looked at it for one more second, and tore it neatly in half. He let the 2 halves fall into the ash between Calloway's boots. "We do not roof foxholes on Iwo Jima," McLaren said, loud enough now that 3 Marines along the seawall turned their heads. "We get off the beach. We keep moving. You are the engineer who's afraid of his own perimeter, Sergeant." He turned and walked away along the seawall. Calloway watched him go. He did not get up. He waited 15 seconds, the way a man waits when he wants to be sure no one is looking at him. Then he reached down between his boots and picked up the 2 halves of the Hershey-Wrapper. He put them carefully into his utility jacket pocket, the one where he kept the pencil stub. He sat for another long moment with his back against the seawall, and he looked at the ash between his boots, and he looked at the casualties piling against the wall 30 feet down, and he looked at the corpsman working on the leg, and he made a small decision quietly to himself that the nickname McLaren had given him was, for the duration of this island, going to be his name. It was a thing he could carry. He could carry worse. Then he stood up. He walked along the inside face of the seawall to the corpsman. He waited until the corpsman finished the tourniquet and looked up. The corpsman was a thin sailor in a stained utility jacket, whose first name, Calloway would later learn, was Mike, and whose last name was Anders, and who was 23 years old and had been in Pacific Naval Medical Service for 14 months. "Where do you want the cover?" Calloway said. Mike Anders looked at him for a second, the way a man looks at someone offering a gift he was not expecting. Then he pointed up the inside face of the seawall, toward a notch in the ash, where two wrecked LVTs had jammed against each other and made a kind of three-sided enclosure. "There," Mike Anders said. "And anywhere else you can put one. They are coming faster than I can stitch them." Calloway nodded once. He walked back to where the torn Hershey-Wrapper had been, sat down again, took the pieces out of his pocket, fitted them back together, and looked at the angle of the cap one more time. He looked at the seawall. He looked at the ash between his boots. He picked up a handful of it and let it run through his fingers. He thought about his uncle Thomas Calloway in Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania, who had been an anthracite mine foreman for 31 years before he died of black lung in 1938, and who had told him once, on a Sunday afternoon at the kitchen table, with his big hands wrapped around a coffee mug, that ash flows where rock breaks. Calloway looked at the ash one more time. Then he stood up and went to find his entrenching tool and a man who could hold a sandbag straight. Up the slope, the Type 92 went into another 3-second burst. The men at the seawall flinched in unison, the way men flinch when they have been on the receiving end of a particular sound for an hour. The corpsman, Mike Anders, did not flinch. He was tying off a forearm bandage on a Marine whose helmet had come off and rolled down the inside of the seawall. Calloway crossed back along the inside face of the wall with his entrenching tool over his shoulder and the torn Hershey-Wrapper folded twice in his utility pocket. And he stopped in the lee of the jammed LVTs that the corpsman had pointed at, and he looked up at the slope above the seawall. He needed to understand what was firing at him. The lower southwest slope of Mount Suribachi at that moment held the southern half of the 28th Marines, 3 rifle battalions, and what was left of the 5th Pioneer Battalion's C Company. The order of battle was, on paper, clear. The southern beachhead had been split into Beach Red 1 and Beach Red 2, with the 28th Marines tasked to swing left and isolate Suribachi from the rest of the island, while the 27th and the 26th drove north. The summit assault on Suribachi was scheduled for D+3. The summit, in the planning briefings, had been treated as a hard but discreet objective. The slope below the summit had been treated as ground to be crossed quickly on the way up. The slope was not ground to be crossed quickly. The slope was a fortress. The Japanese had spent 8 months turning the lower slopes of the volcano into a network of mutually supporting spider holes and bunker positions, tied together by an interior tunnel system that ran for nearly 15 miles inside the volcanic rock of the mountain itself. The defenders, by Calloway's day on the beach, were elements of the 312th Independent Infantry Battalion and a battery of 70mm howitzers concealed in caves on the western face. The Type 92 heavy machine gun that had been working the seawall in 3-second bursts was one of, by intelligence estimate, 11 Type 92s on the lower slope alone. The Type 99 Arisaka rifles in the spider holes were carried by riflemen who had been trained to shoot at the legs of an advancing Marine, because a man with a Garand round through his femoral artery occupied 2 corpsmen for an hour and removed 3 Marines from the line for the same hour. The mortar walk that was working the beach left to right and right to left was a coordinated indirect fire shoot by 81mm crews dug in along a saddle that was, at that moment, 300 yards above where Calloway stood. Calloway did not know the order of battle. He knew the noise. The noise told him most of what he needed. The Type 92 was the priority. The Type 92 sat above and to the right, behind a fold of black ash and a single tortured pandanus tree that had survived 2 days of naval gunfire and looked, from below, like a wire skeleton bent against the sky. The Type 92 could traverse maybe 60 degrees of beach. The Type 92 had a clean line on the inside face of the seawall for about 40 yards. Inside those 40 yards, anything above the wall was a target. Outside those 40 yards, a man could move briefly. The casualty collection point that Mike Anders had organized in the lee of the jammed LVTs sat just inside the 40 yards. The mortar walk was the second problem. The mortar walk was the slower killer. A man could read the mortar walk if he listened for 90 seconds. The 81s walked the beach in patterns of 4, 2 rounds left to right, 2 rounds right to left, then 30 seconds of silence, then again. A Marine who knew the pattern could time his moves. A Marine who did not could be killed in the silence between the second and the third pattern, when the gun crew was reloading. The Type 99 snipers were the third problem and the most personal. The Type 99 snipers were patient. They fired 1 round per quarter hour, from spider holes nobody had located, at men they had selected. The first round of every shoot was at a corpsman, or a man carrying a sandbag. The second was at the man who came forward to help the first. Calloway had been on the beach 2 hours, and he had counted, by sound alone, 11 Type 99 reports. He had located none of them. He sat with his back against the wreck of one of the LVTs and pulled the Hershey-Wrapper out of his pocket. He flattened it on his knee. He looked at the cross-section he had drawn earlier, and he added 1 line. The line was the angle of the offset to the entry, 90 degrees to the bearing of the Type 92. He thought about his uncle Thomas Calloway for the second time that morning. Hubert Calloway was 34 years old. He had been born in the village of Mahanoy City, Pennsylvania, the second son of a Welsh miner named Owain Calloway, who had crossed from Merthyr Tydfil in 1899 and had married a Polish girl named Stefania Wojciechowski 2 years later. The family name had been anglicized in the parish register because the priest at St. Joseph's could not spell Wojciechowski. Hubert had quit school at 15 and gone into the anthracite mines as a breaker boy. By the time he was 22, he was a coal-face man at one of the local collieries north of the town. By the time he was 27, he was a section foreman. The man who had taught him the trade of overhead rock mechanics was his uncle Tomas, his father's older brother, a mine foreman at the Glenburn Colliery near Shamokin, who had been pulled out of a collapsed gallery on the 3rd of November 1936 after 11 hours under 3 feet of rock. Tomas had walked again. He had never gone back into a mine. He had died on a kitchen chair at his sister-in-law's house in Mahanoy City in March 1938 of complications from coal dust accumulated over 31 years of underground work. His last conversation with Hubert had been about the angle of an overhead on a Sunday afternoon, with a mug of bitter coffee between them on the kitchen table. Thomas had drawn the angle on a piece of butcher's paper with the same kind of pencil stub Hubert now had in his utility jacket pocket. The angle had been 12 degrees. Thomas had said, in his accent that was half Welsh and half Polish and entirely his own, that you did not fight rock when rock wanted to break. You let it break, and you stood where the broken pieces did not go. He had said, ash flows where rock breaks. Hubert had not understood the sentence at the time. He had been 25 years old and he had thought he was being given a homily. He had nodded and finished his coffee and gone home. His uncle had died 6 months later. The sentence had sat in Hubert's head for 9 years without finding a use. It found one on Red Beach. One on the morning of February 20th. The pencil stub he was holding was the same pencil stub his uncle had used to draw the angle on the butcher's paper. Hubert had taken it out of the kitchen drawer the day after Thomas's funeral. He had carried it for 7 years through 3 Pacific landings. The lead was worn down to half an inch. The wood was scored with the marks of 3 sharpening knives. He kept it in the same utility pocket as the pieces of the Hershey-Wrapper. In his other utility pocket, he kept a Hamilton pocket watch on a brass chain. The watch had belonged to his father, who had bought it new at a railway supply store in Shamokin in 1912, and had carried it into the mine every shift for 27 years. The crystal had a small chip in the lower right corner. The minute hand was original. The hour hand had been replaced once. Hubert had carried the watch on Guadalcanal and on Tarawa, and now on Iwo Jima. It had not stopped. A Marine he half knew came along the seawall and crouched beside him. The Marine's name was PFC Stan Maslowski. Maslowski was from Hamtramck, Michigan, 21 years old, a former assembly line worker at the Dodge main plant. Maslowski had a sandbag over his shoulder and a question on his face. "Sergeant," Maslowski said, "Sergeant Anders says you are building cover." "I am. Where do you want me?" Calloway pointed at the notch in the seawall where the 2 LVTs had jammed. He said, I want a hole 3 feet below grade, 6 by 5 at the bottom, with an offset entry on the south face. I want the spoil piled at 12 degrees on the upper. Not flat, not steep, 12. Maslowski looked at the notch. He looked at the ash that they would have to dig. He looked at the seawall. He looked at the slope above with the Type 92 hammering through its 3-second cycle. He looked back at Calloway. 12 degrees, Maslowski said. 12. Sergeant, Maslowski said, if I dig that hole, will it hold? Calloway took the pencil stub out of his pocket and the 2 halves of the Hershey-Wrapper. He showed Maslowski the cross-section. He pointed at the cap. He pointed at the angle. He said, it will hold. Maslowski looked at the wrapper for a long moment. He said, all right, Sergeant. He went to find his entrenching tool. By the middle of the afternoon, there were 4 holes started along the inside face of the seawall, set at 20-yard intervals. Calloway worked the cross-section of each one with his entrenching tool and a borrowed combat shovel. The corpsman Mike Anders kept stitching at the casualty collection point. The Type 92 went on hammering at its 3-second cycle. The 81mm mortar walk worked the beach left to right and right to left without breaking pattern. 2 more Marines from Calloway's section drifted over to the holes and started digging without being told. Their names were Corporal Adam Birch from Tulsa, Oklahoma, 26 years old, who had been a roofer before the war, and PFC Pete Reardon from Newark, New Jersey, 18 years old, who had been a sophomore at St. Benedict's Prep when he enlisted. Reardon was the youngest man Calloway had ever seen put a shovel into volcanic ash. Reardon had a rosary wound twice around his left wrist, on which the wooden beads were already worn dark from being thumbed. By dusk on D+1, the first of the 4 holes was complete. It was 3 feet below grade, 6 by 5 at the bottom, with the spoil piled at 12 degrees on the upper face, and a sandbag course laid across the highest mound, and an offset entry cut at 90 degrees to the Type 92's line of fire. Calloway looked at it in the failing light. He thought it would hold a 70mm round on the cap. He was not yet sure it would hold a direct hit from a Type 92 burst on the entry. The entry was the place a man could still die. Mike Anders came over from the casualty collection point and looked at the hole. He looked at it for a long time. He said, Sergeant, there is a runner from Major Dyer looking for you. Calloway nodded. The runner was a private named Earl Pomeroy, who had taken a splinter in the cheek somewhere on the way down the beach and was bleeding lightly through a field dressing taped to his jaw. Pomeroy said, Sergeant, the Major wants to know why you are not at the seawall breach detail. Calloway said, tell the Major the breach is not the problem tonight. Pomeroy looked at him. Pomeroy looked at the hole behind him. Pomeroy looked at Mike Anders, standing at the casualty collection point with his hands bloody to the elbow. Pomeroy turned around and walked back up the beach without saying anything. Calloway looked at the slope. The summit assault was scheduled for the morning of D+3, less than 36 hours away. The Type 92 had not slackened in 8 hours. The mortar walk had not slackened either. He could hear, somewhere up the lower slope, the small, dry crack of a Type 99 Arasaka, and he could not place it. He did not yet know it, but the round had taken a Marine at the seawall 4 holes down from his own. The Marine had been carrying a sandbag. He took the Hamilton pocket watch out of his utility jacket and looked at it. The hands read 6:51. He wound the watch 1.5 turns and closed the case. He put it back in his pocket. He looked at McLaren's torn Hershey-Wrapper one more time. He looked at the 4 holes along the seawall. He looked at his uncle's pencil stub in his hand. He decided on the cooling beach and the failing light that he was going to build the rest of the holes by his own method, whether McLaren liked it or not, and that he was going to do it before sunrise of D+2, because the regulation profile would be in place by morning along the rest of the seawall, and he had seen the regulation profile fail twice already that afternoon to a 70mm round. He had counted 3 dead from the regulation profile in the holes to his right. He had not yet counted any dead from his own holes, because his own holes were not yet full. He intended to keep them not full. He went to find Maslowski and Birch and Reardon. The Japanese mortar crew up the slope began the next pattern of 4. The first round of the pattern fell 40 yards to the east of where Calloway was standing. The second round fell 10 yards closer. He stopped counting. The third round of the pattern fell short. The fourth fell long. The seawall held. The hole held. Maslowski stayed inside and did not move for 2 minutes after the pattern was complete, and then he came out and went back to digging the second hole at the next notch down. Calloway stood at the lip of the first hole and watched him go and did not say anything. There was nothing useful left to say. He took the Hamilton pocket watch out of his utility jacket and read the dial again. 7:15. The sun was gone behind the volcano, and the beach was lit only by the irregular yellow flares the Japanese were sending up at random intervals to look for movement. He worked until almost 3 in the morning. By that time, the second hole was complete, and the third was at the cap stage, and the fourth was a pit, awaiting its first lift of compacted ash. Reardon and Birch and Maslowski had taken 20-minute rests in rotation through the small hours of D+2. Mike Anders had brought them coffee in a battered enamel jug at midnight, which Calloway suspected he had ground out of his own stores. The casualty collection point behind the LVTs had been quiet for an hour because the Japanese had eased the mortar walk while the moon was up, and a Marine with a sandbag could move along the seawall for short distances if he kept low. The standard solution had failed by then 4 times along the same seawall. The standard solution was straightforward. It was published in USMC Field Manual FM5-15, which was the Field Fortification Manual, and which had been written in the years between the wars and revised in 1941 and again in 1943. The standard cover for a 2-man hole was timber and sandbags. The timber went down first. As a cribbed log set above the hole at the lip, sandbags were laid in 2 courses across the timber, with the upper course staggered to break vertical seams. The cap profile was flat or near flat. A man inside the hole had something solid above his head and could survive a near miss from a small caliber round, provided the timber was sized correctly. The standard solution had 2 problems on Iwo Jima. The first problem was that there was no timber. The island had no surviving trees by the morning of D+2. The pre-invasion bombardment had taken down what little vegetation had stood, and the few palm and pandanus trees that had survived were not structural. The regulation lumber, sized cribbing timbers, 6 inches by 8 inches by 6 feet long, was on pallets stacked on the open beach 200 yards north of where Calloway was working, under direct fire from the Type 92 and being lost in numbers. A pioneer Sergeant Calloway had seen at the LST briefing the night before a man named Walt Krzminski, who had run the Tarawa Beach lumber detail with him in November '43, had been killed at 3 the previous afternoon while trying to move a pallet of cribbing timbers off the open ash with a TD9 dozer. The dozer had taken a 70mm round on the engine block. Krzminski had been crushed against the seawall by the falling cribbing. Calloway had not been at the seawall when it happened, and he had not learned about it until just after midnight, when Mike Anders had come along with the coffee jug and had told him by way of saying that the standard cribbing was not going to arrive at any rate Calloway could plan around. The second problem was that the standard sandbag-only cap, without timber, did not stop shrapnel from a 70mm round in fine volcanic ash. This Calloway had observed for himself. A Marine 3 holes down the seawall, working under another pioneer section sergeant, had built the regulation profile at 4 in the afternoon of D+1, using whatever cribbing he could scavenge from a single broken pallet. 3 short timbers, not enough, and a double course of sandbags on the cap. A 70mm round had landed on the cap at 5:30. The shrapnel had not been stopped by the timber and sandbag composite. The shrapnel had punched down through the sandbag course and through the timber and into the hole. The 2 Marines inside the hole had been killed. Calloway had watched Mike Anders walk over and confirm the dead and walk back. Mike Anders had not said anything to Calloway about it. The silence had been a sentence. The sandbag-only cap, without timber, was worse. A sandbag-only cap was tried in 2 holes along the seawall during the late afternoon of D+1. Both holes had taken near misses. Both holes had lost men. Sandbag only stopped small arms, but did not stop the casing fragments from a high explosive round. A 70mm round did not have to land on the cap to kill. A near miss at 10 feet sent fragments through 8 inches of dry sandbag, like the sandbag was sacking. Calloway had thought about the problem on the walk back from looking at the second sandbag-only hole. He had thought about it through the dinner he had not eaten. He had been thinking about it when McLaren tore the Hershey-Wrapper. The answer had come at 1 in the morning of D+2. Calloway had been on his knees at the lip of the third hole, working a sandbag into place by feel, because the moon had gone behind a cloud, when he had put his bare left hand into the soft ash on the upper face and felt the way it moved against the sandbag. The ash compressed and slid and packed without resistance. It did not break. It did not crack. It flowed. It flowed around the sandbag corner the way water flows around a stone in a stream bed. He had sat back on his heels and looked at his hand. The ash was on his glove and on his sleeve and on the inside of his utility cuff. It had no edges. It had no fracture. It was the opposite of rock. His uncle's sentence came back to him with the force of a struck bell. Ash flows where rock breaks. He thought about it for 10 minutes on his heels at the lip of the hole. He thought about what a 70-millimeter casing fragment did when it hit rock. It struck and shattered the rock, and the rock fragments became secondary projectiles inside the hole. He thought about what the same casing fragment did when it hit dry sand. The sand absorbed some of the energy, but the fragment kept going, because the sand grains were small enough to compress and then transmit the force through. He thought about what the same casing fragment did when it hit dry volcanic ash. He did not know. He had never seen it tested, but he knew the ash. The ash was lighter than sand. The ash was finer than sand. The ash had void space between the grains because the grains were irregular and rough at the microscopic scale, not smooth. The ash, compacted dry, behaved like a viscous fluid under sudden impact. The fragment would push into the ash, and the ash would close around the fragment, and the kinetic energy would dissipate over distance because the ash would flow rather than fracture. The ash was the opposite of rock. The ash was what was left after the rock had broken. A composite cap, 3 lifts of dry, compacted ash, 1 sandbag course on the upper face for waterproofing and small arms, mounded at 12 degrees, so any fragment that did make it through the sandbag would have to traverse the maximum thickness of ash before reaching the man inside. Calloway took the pencil stub and the Hershey-Wrapper out of his pocket. He drew the cross-section again, more carefully this time, by the light of a Japanese flare that hung white over the slope above. He drew the 3 lifts of ash with horizontal hatching for each lift. He drew the sandbag course on the upper face. He drew the offset entry at 90 degrees. He drew an arrow pointing at the cap and wrote 3 words: ash flows, no fragment. Then he stood up and went to find Reardon, who was working the cap of the 4th hole with a regulation profile. He told Reardon to start over. He told Reardon to take the sandbags off the upper face and lay them aside. He told Reardon to dig out the partial cap and to bring 3 buckets of dry ash up from the lower face of the seawall, where the ash was driest, and to lay the ash in 3 separate lifts on the cap, compacted with the back of the entrenching tool between each lift. He told Reardon to lay 1 sandbag course over the upper face after the 3rd lift was set, and to mount the whole thing at 12 degrees from horizontal, and to use the folding rule from Reardon's own kit to set the angle. He showed Reardon the drawing. Reardon looked at the drawing for a long moment by the light of the dying flare. Reardon was 18 years old and had been a sophomore at St. Benedict's Prep 8 months earlier and had a rosary wound twice around his left wrist. Reardon said, "Sergeant, will this hold?" "Yes," Calloway said. "How do you know?" Calloway said, "My uncle told me." Reardon looked at Calloway. He looked at the drawing again. He looked at the cap of the half-built hole. He said, "All right, Sergeant." He started over. By 2:30 in the morning, the 4th hole was complete with the new cap. By 3 in the morning, Calloway and Maslowski had stripped the regulation profile off the 3rd hole and rebuilt it the new way. By 4 in the morning, the 2nd hole had been rebuilt also. By 5 in the morning, with the first gray beginning to show east of the volcano, all 4 holes along Calloway's section of the seawall had the new composite cap. The work had taken 7 hours. The holes had used no timber. The holes had used roughly 40 sandbags between them, less than half the regulation requirement. Calloway stood in the cool ash at the lip of the 1st hole at 5:15 and looked along the seawall at his 4 holes. The Hamilton pocket watch was in his hand. The mortar walk had started again 10 minutes earlier. The Type 92 was hammering at the same 3-second cycle. the cycle it had been hammering for 23 hours without break. The corpsman Mike Anders came along the seawall with 2 enamel mugs of coffee. He gave one to Calloway. He did not say anything for a long time. He said eventually, "Sergeant, there is a wounded Marine I cannot move on the south end of the casualty collection point. He is bleeding into his lung. He needs cover. I cannot put him in the standard hole because the standard hole 40 yards down took a fragment burst at midnight." Calloway took a sip of the coffee. The coffee was bitter and old, and the best thing he had tasted in 2 days. He handed the mug back to Mike Anders. He said, "Take me to him." The wounded Marine was a corporal from Maine named Earl Drohan, 22 years old, who had been hit in the upper chest by an airsock around 3 hours earlier, and who was breathing in small, fast, shallow breaths, and who could not be lifted onto a stretcher without making it worse. Calloway looked at him. Mike Anders looked at Calloway. Drohan looked at the sky above the seawall. Calloway put his hands under Drohan's shoulders. Mike Anders took Drohan's legs. They carried him along the inside face of the seawall for 60 yards, slowly, in 8 separate stops to let Drohan breathe, and they brought him into the second hole. They laid him out on the floor of the hole with his head against the back wall and a folded utility jacket under his neck. Mike Anders settled in beside him with the morphine syringe already prepared. Calloway sat in the offset entry for a long minute, looking at Drohan's face. Drohan opened his eyes once and looked at Calloway, and looked at the cap of the hole above him, and looked at Calloway again and did not say anything. Calloway went back to work. The first light of D+2 was on the ash by the time he came out of the hole. McLaren was standing 30 feet down the seawall with another pioneer sergeant Calloway did not recognize, looking at the cap of the third hole. McLaren had his hands on his hips. McLaren was speaking, and the other sergeant was nodding. Calloway watched them for a moment from a distance. He did not approach. McLaren looked up the seawall and saw Calloway watching and held his eyes for 2 seconds. The look was not friendly. McLaren turned back to the other sergeant and pointed at the cap of the third hole and said, loud enough for Calloway to hear, "You will get a captain's mast for ignoring the regulation profile, Calloway. The major will see this by noon." Calloway said nothing. He was not going to say anything in front of an audience. McLaren and the other sergeant walked away up the beach. The Type 92 started another cycle. The mortar walk began the next pattern of 4. Mike Anders came out of the second hole and stood at the lip and said quietly to Calloway, "Drohan is stable. The hole is dry. He can stay where he is until they get a Higgins boat in." Calloway nodded. Mike Anders said, "Sergeant, the summit assault is at noon tomorrow. The Japanese will not let the beach quiet down before then." "I know," Calloway said. He looked up the slope. The sky was already changing color from gray to a thin, watered yellow. The Pandana skeleton above the Type 92's position was visible now, gaunt against the lightening sky. He thought he could see, behind it, the outline of one of the spider holes, a small, dark notch in the ash near the base of the tree. The order was, hold the beachhead through the night of D+2 and into the morning of D+3. The summit attack would go in at noon of D+3. The Japanese knew the summit attack was coming. The Japanese would, before then, throw every round they had at the southern beachhead to break the assault staging area. The 4 holes along his section of the seawall would be tested before the next sunrise. The first 70mm round of the counter-bombardment landed at 11 minutes past 9 on the morning of D+2. It landed in the open ash 40 feet south of Calloway's third hole and threw a fan of black sand and white smoke 100 feet into the air. The seawall took the blast on its outer face. The hole shook. Reardon, who was in the third hole at the time with Birch and 4 wounded Marines from the casualty collection point, told Calloway later that the dust did not fall through the cap. The dust shook loose from the upper face of the sandbag course and drifted down between the ash lifts and stopped halfway. The men inside the hole did not feel the round. They heard it. The second round landed 9 seconds later, 20 feet to the east of the first. The same result. The Japanese had brought a second 70mm howitzer onto the lower slope during the night, dug into a cave Calloway had not been able to see from the seawall the previous afternoon. The 2 guns alternated fire for the next 3 hours. The Type 92 hammered through its own cycle on top of the howitzer fire. The Type 99 snipers came up out of their spider holes at intervals and shot at any Marine they could see moving along the seawall. By noon of D+2, every hole along Callaway's section of seawall held men in it. The first hole had Maslowski and 3 Marines from B Company, who had been moved up under fire. The second hole had Mike Anders and Drohan and a corpsman named Schiff, who had run down from the LST hospital on a hand stretcher. The third hole had Birch and Reardon and 4 wounded Marines. The fourth hole had Callaway himself and 3 Marines from C Company, who he had moved in at 11:30 when the regulation profile hole next to them took a near miss and lost both occupants. Callaway did not get out of the fourth hole for the next 68 hours. The test was not, as he had thought it might be, a single overwhelming bombardment. The test was patient. The test was 9 days of rolling fire, 70mm howitzer rounds at irregular intervals, Type 92 bursts on the entries and along the upper seawall, Type 99 sniper fire on any Marine who showed his helmet above the lip, and the periodic 81mm mortar walk traversing left to right and right to left across the inside face of the seawall. The Japanese were not trying to overrun the beachhead. They were trying to grind the Southern Assault Force down before the summit attack went in. The summit attack in the end was delayed by 24 hours and then by another 24 hours, and then went up on the morning of D+4, when First Lieutenant Harold Schreier led the patrol from E Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, to the top of Suribachi and put the first small flag on it. Callaway did not see the flag. He was 60 feet below the summit in the fourth hole when Schreier's patrol went up. Inside the fourth hole, the routine was simple. The men slept in 2-hour rotations along the back wall, sitting against it with their helmets on. Callaway kept the Hamilton pocket watch in his left hand and worked the offset entry with his right whenever the firing slackened. He brought in 2 more wounded Marines on the afternoon of D+3 and a corpsman called Olin Schroeder on the morning of D+4. He kept the cap maintained. He sent Birch out twice to repack the second hole's cap after a near miss had loosened the upper lift of ash. And Birch came back both times unhit. By the morning of D+5, the section had lost no men inside any of the 4 holes. The section had lost 3 men outside the holes, 2 to Type 99 snipers on D+3, and 1 to a 70mm round that had landed in the open ash 20 feet from where the Marine had been carrying a sandbag. McLaren came down the seawall during the lull on the morning of D+3. He did not look at Callaway. He went to the third hole and looked at the cap and the offset entry and stood there for a long minute, and then walked back up the beach. He came back at 5:30 in the afternoon, in the lull between the third and fourth 70mm bombardment of the day, and this time he stopped at the entry to the fourth hole, where Callaway was sitting. McLaren said, "Callaway, Sergeant." McLaren looked at the cap of the fourth hole. He looked at the angle of the mound. He looked at the offset entry. He looked at Callaway. He did not say anything else. He nodded once. He walked back up the beach. He came back at 3 in the morning of D+4. He came back because the regulation profile hole he had built himself, 80 yards down the beach, took a direct hit at 2:50 in the morning from a 70mm round, and the cribbing and double sandbag course had not held, and the 4 Marines inside it had been killed instantly, and McLaren had not been inside when the round landed because he had stepped out 20 minutes earlier to find a water can. He came along the seawall at 3 with the white face of a man who has just understood something that has been outside his understanding for 48 hours. He stopped at the offset entry of the fourth hole. He did not say anything. Callaway looked at him for 2 seconds. Then Callaway reached out his left hand and pulled McLaren in by the front of his utility jacket. McLaren came in without resistance. He sat down hard against the back wall of the fourth hole between PFC Maslowski and a Marine from C Company whose name was Stockard. McLaren pressed his back flat against the wall and shut his eyes and put one hand over his right ear and did not move for the next 6 hours. The 70mm rounds came in every 20 minutes through the rest of the night and into the morning. The Type 92 hammered through its cycle. McLaren did not open his eyes. He did not say anything. Callaway watched him for the first 2 hours and then stopped watching him. On the morning of D+4, with Schreier's flag going up the summit 4 miles to the north and slightly to the east, Callaway took the Hamilton pocket watch out of his utility jacket pocket and read the dial. The dial read 4 hours and 11 minutes past 9 on the morning of D+4. The hour hand had not stopped. He wound the watch 1.5 turns and closed the case and put it back in his pocket. He counted the days. He counted from the first 70mm round, which had come in at 11 minutes past 9 on D+2, to the first quiet hour on the morning of D+10, which began at 6:20 on the morning of the 1st of March. 9 days. 22 Marines came out of the 4 holes alive on the morning of the 1st of March. The names are in the 5th Pioneer Battalion AAR. I have set down the names I know in the order they were recorded. Staff Sergeant Hubert Calloway, Staff Sergeant Hugh McLaren, Corporal Adam Birch, Private First Class Stan Maslowski, PFC Pete Reardon, Pharmacist's Mate Second Class Mike Anders, Pharmacist's Mate Third Class Olin Schroeder, Pharmacist's Mate First Class Eugene Schiff, Corporal Earl Drohan, Private First Class Robert Stockard, and 12 more whose names are in the AAR I have on photostat, but which I will not put here, because 2 of those names belong to men who, when the script was being drafted, still had immediate family living in towns I could find. The 4 regulation profile holes inside Calloway's 80-yard section of seawall, the ones built by other sections during D+1 and D+2, had a total of 8 men killed inside them over the same 9 days. 3 more had been killed outside the holes. McLaren's own hole, the one he had not been in when the 70mm round took it, had 4 killed. Mike Anders had been wounded in the chest on the afternoon of D+5 by an Arisaka round that had come through the offset entry of the 2nd hole at the only angle from which a Type 99 could reach a man inside the hole. The round had passed through Mike Anders' upper left chest and had lodged in the back wall of the hole. Mike Anders had stayed on his feet for 14 seconds, finished the stitch he was making on a Marine's thigh, and then sat down in the corner. Calloway had crossed from the 4th hole to the 2nd hole in 22 seconds during a gap in the 70mm fire, had pulled Mike Anders' utility jacket open, had packed a field dressing into the wound, and had stayed with him for the next 3 hours until the bleeding stopped. Mike Anders did not lose consciousness. He was evacuated by Higgins' boat on the morning of D+7. PFC Pete Reardon kept his rosary on his left wrist through all 9 days. He did not say it aloud. He thumbed the beads. The beads were already worn dark before the test, and they were worn darker by the morning of the 1st of March. Reardon walked out of the 3rd hole at 6:25 on the morning of the 1st of March and went to find his squad. His squad had moved north up the island. He found them at 4 in the afternoon. He was 18 years and 4 months old. On the morning of the 1st of March, with the southern beachhead at last quiet for the first time in 9 days, McLaren left the 4th hole at 6:31. He walked along the seawall to the 3rd hole. He stood at the lip of the 3rd hole for 1 minute. He looked at the cap. He looked at the angle of the mound. He took a folding rule out of his utility jacket pocket. The rule was a standard Marine Pioneer NCO's 6-inch boxwood folding rule, marked in inches and centimeters, and he opened it and held it against the angle of the cap. He read the angle. He wrote the number down on the back of his own field notebook. The number was 12 degrees, measured to the nearest half degree. He stood up. He walked along the seawall to the offset entry of the 4th hole, where Calloway was sitting with his back against the wall and the Hamilton pocket watch open in his left hand. McLaren stopped at the entry. He looked at Calloway. He said one sentence. Calloway was right. He walked away up the beach toward the C Company